The war was ending, though no one yet dared to say it aloud. In the skies above the Rhine Valley, the wreckage of the Reich's final hopes burned against the cold March sun. High above a patchwork of bombed fields and fractured forests, a Messerschmitt 109 trailed a long black ribbon of smoke, and inside it, Captain Hans Werner Lerche fought a losing battle against gravity and fate. He was 26, one of the Luftwaffe's most seasoned test pilots, a man who had flown every machine the Reich had dared to build. But now the cockpit stank of burning oil, hydraulic fluid, and cordite. The instruments danced wildly. His shoulder throbbed where hot shrapnel had bitten deep. He could barely grip the control stick. Beneath the smoke, the land that had once been his home stretched out, a place now crawling with enemies. Every pilot knew the propaganda by heart. Americans tortured prisoners. They executed downed airmen. They starved captives and turned them over to the Russians. Goering's machine had filled German minds with horror stories, and though Hans had never fully believed them, he had seen what his own countrymen had done to captured Allied pilots. Some Wehrmacht units still followed the rules of war. Others did not. And the SS? They killed simply to prove loyalty. Why would the Americans be any different? His altimeter spun madly, 2,000 feet. Flames licked the floor of his cockpit. The canopy glass was smeared with oil. 1,000. Somewhere below, he imagined the Americans already racing toward the crash site, rifles ready, vengeance burning in their eyes. He thought of his wife, Hildegard, and their daughter back in Bad Worrishofen. Would they ever learn what became of him? Or would he vanish into the fog of war? Just another name on a list of men who never came home. 500 feet. The Bavarian countryside, green and brown and torn with shell fire, rushed upward. Hans pulled the canopy release. The mechanism jammed once, then gave with a metallic scream. Icy air blasted his face as the canopy tore away. He unfastened the harness with his good hand, the other slick with blood, and threw himself into the void. For an instant there was nothing but wind. Savage, freezing wind that howled in his ears as he tumbled end over end through the sky. Then the parachute snapped open, yanking him hard enough to make him cry out. The silk canopy bloomed white above him, a fragile flower in the chaos of battle. Below, his Messerschmitt slammed into a field and exploded into a pillar of black smoke. He was alive, against all odds, alive. But that meant facing what came next. Through the haze, Hans saw them. American soldiers, tiny shapes running across the field, jeeps bouncing over the dirt roads, rifles raised. They looked young, too young to have faces hardened by war, but he knew better than to hope for mercy. His mind replayed every story, every whisper of torture and humiliation. He was the enemy, a Luftwaffe officer. They would kill him for sure. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his shoulder as he rolled into the mud. The parachute dragged him several meters before collapsing beside him, its white fabric lying limp like a flag of surrender. For a moment, Hans just lay there, tasting dirt and blood, the ringing in his ears so loud he could barely think. The war was over for him. Perhaps his life was too. Boots pounded closer, shouts in English, sharp, commanding. He forced himself to his knees, swaying, dizzy from blood loss. His left arm hung useless. He raised his right hand, palm open, the universal gesture of surrender, though every instinct in his body screamed that it was futile. The first Americans burst from the tree line, rifles leveled. There were 5, maybe 6. Mud-splattered faces, helmets askew, uniforms streaked with exhaustion. A sergeant led them, broad-shouldered, his weapon trained squarely on Hans's chest. The others fanned out, moving with the wary precision of men who had seen too much death. Hans's legs trembled. He could feel the cold steel of their stares even from several meters away. He wanted to speak, to say nicht schießen, don't shoot, but the words caught in his throat. All he could do was stand there, shaking, arm raised, waiting for the shot that would end it. The sergeant barked something. Hans didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Don't move. Seconds passed, or maybe it was a lifetime. The wind rustled the parachute fabric. Somewhere behind the soldiers, a jeep engine idled softly. The sergeant stepped closer, his finger still tight on the trigger. He looked Hans up and down, the blood, the uniform, the iron cross pinned to his chest. His expression was hard, but not cruel, just a man weighing a choice. And then, against everything Hans expected, the rifle lowered. "Get the medic," the sergeant shouted over his shoulder. "This one's hurt bad." Hans blinked. He thought he had misheard. But then a young soldier with red hair and freckles came sprinting forward with a canvas medical bag. The boy knelt beside him, breathing hard, hands trembling slightly as he tore open bandages. "Easy there, buddy," the medic said, his voice soft, his eyes steady. "You're going to be all right." Hans wanted to protest, to tell him it was absurd, that he was their enemy, but the words never came. The morphine needle slipped into his thigh, and the pain melted into distant warmth. The medic's touch was gentle, almost tender, as he cleaned the wound and wrapped the shoulder tight. The sergeant lit a lucky strike, took a drag, then offered it to Hans. For the first time in years, Hans tasted real tobacco. The smoke filled his lungs and brought tears to his eyes, not from the sting, but from something deeper. Gratitude, confusion, the shattering realization that maybe everything he had been told about these men was wrong. He looked up at the sergeant, this stranger who had chosen mercy over vengeance, and whispered brokenly, "Danke." The sergeant nodded once as if to say, "We're all just soldiers, friend." As the medic finished dressing his wounds, the voices around Hans began to blur. The morphine pulled him down into a warm, dark tide. His last clear thought before losing consciousness was not of death or defeat, but of a single, impossible truth: the enemy had saved him. When Hans opened his eyes again, the world was blurred, heavy, and strangely quiet. The scent of antiseptic replaced that of burning oil. Canvas fluttered overhead in the soft wind. For a moment he didn't know where he was, only that the roar of war had faded. Then came the faint rhythm of boots and murmured English voices nearby. He was alive. That meant the Americans hadn't finished him off. Memory returned in fragments. The crash, the shouting, the medic's freckled face, the sergeant's calm voice cutting through the chaos. "Get the medic. This one's hurt bad." It replayed in his head like a dream he couldn't explain. Why had they saved him? Why would any sane man help the enemy in the middle of a war? He tried to move, groaning when his shoulder burned like fire. A hand appeared in his field of vision. Steady, firm, unmistakably human. "Easy there, Captain," came a voice with a southern drawl. The sergeant. He was kneeling beside the cot, rolling up Hans's sleeve to check the bandages. His face was lined with fatigue, the kind that came from too many nights under artillery thunder, but his eyes were steady, almost kind. "You're lucky we got to you quick," he said, lighting another lucky strike. "That arm would have gone bad if we'd waited an hour." Hans blinked in confusion. "Why?" he managed to whisper, his accent thick. "Why help me?" The sergeant gave a half smile that wasn't mocking. "Because you're a soldier, same as us. War's almost done anyway. No point adding another ghost." Hans didn't fully understand the words, but the tone said everything. Compassion, not pity. Duty, not cruelty. He lay back, exhausted. Around him, the small field hospital was a collage of contradictions. Cots lined up beneath khaki tents, nurses moving between the wounded, both German and American lying only feet apart. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the sharp scent of tobacco and coffee. Somewhere, a radio hummed faintly with a swing tune. Glenn Miller, perhaps. It sounded absurdly peaceful. "Water," Hans whispered. His throat was dry as sand. The red-haired medic appeared again, grinning. "You remember me?" "Private Denny Miller," he said slowly, as though teaching a child. "Here, drink." He tilted the canteen carefully. Cool water ran down Hans's chin. The medic just wiped it away with his sleeve. "Small sips, Fritz. You'll live." The name Fritz stung, but not with hatred. It was what American soldiers called every German. There was no venom in it, just habit. The medic even chuckled softly. "You know, you Krauts make good planes, but terrible luck." Hans managed a faint, weary smile. The boy's humor, however strange, was proof that he was being treated like a person. The fear that had consumed him since the crash began to loosen its grip. Hours blurred into days. The sergeant visited often, always brief, always with that quiet composure of someone who'd seen too much. He never gave his name, only called himself Sergeant. Yet every time he stepped into the tent, the air felt a little safer. On the third morning, Hans saw the medic carrying coffee between the rows of beds. "For you too, Captain," Denny said, placing a steaming tin mug beside him. "Don't say I never did nothing for the Luftwaffe." Hans stared at the dark liquid. Real coffee, not the bitter barley substitute they'd been drinking in Germany for years. He lifted it to his lips and inhaled. The smell alone almost broke him. Tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. He turned his face away, ashamed, but the medic only pretended not to notice. Later that afternoon, a transport truck rumbled past the tent. Through the canvas flap, Hans glimpsed rows of prisoners in grey uniforms being loaded aboard under guard. Some stared blankly, others shouted insults he couldn't hear. The sergeant paused beside Hans's cot, watching the scene. "They're heading to the big camp," he explained. "You, though, you're staying here till that shoulder heals." Hans hesitated, then asked, softly, "Why not camp?" The sergeant exhaled smoke through his nose. "You're an officer, and a pilot. Intel wants a word with you later. But don't worry, nobody's gonna rough you up. We ain't like the stories your people tell." Hans's heart clenched. "We ain't like the stories." Those words echoed louder than any sermon. That night, under the dim lantern glow, he watched Denny clean his medical instruments with meticulous care. Nearby, the sergeant sat on an ammo crate, humming to himself, one hand resting on his rifle, not from threat, but from habit. Outside, rain began to patter on the canvas, soft and rhythmic. Hans thought of Hildegard again. Her laughter, the way their daughter's tiny hand fit in his. He imagined them somewhere far away, maybe hearing Allied bombers overhead and praying he was still alive. The morphine helped, but it was the kindness that eased the fear. He realized he hadn't felt truly safe in years, not even among his own. In the early dawn, the sergeant came once more, checking the dressings, the pulse, the temperature. Before leaving, he reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the crate beside the bed, a single, unlit Lucky Strike. "For when you're up again," he said quietly. "Figured you might need the comfort." Hans looked at the cigarette, the small, absurd token of humanity between enemies. When he glanced up again to thank him, the sergeant was already walking away, the flap of the tent swaying shut behind him. Hans stared after him for a long time. Somewhere deep inside, a conviction began to grow, fragile but unstoppable, that this man's choice, that one decision to lower his rifle, had done more than save a single life. It had saved Hans's faith in people. He whispered the words softly in German, "Ein guter Mann," a good man. And as the morning light filtered through the tent, Hans knew that something inside him had already begun to change. When Hans awoke again, the world was cleaner, brighter, and impossibly quiet. He was lying on a real mattress, wrapped in white sheets that smelled faintly of soap and sunshine. For the first time in years, he wasn't cold. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't afraid. The pain in his shoulder had dulled to a distant throb, proof that someone had tended to him with skill and care. The ceiling above him was not cracked plaster or smoke-stained concrete, but clean canvas stretched over wooden beams. Sunlight filtered through the open flaps of the tent, carrying the scent of wet earth and spring air. Somewhere nearby, a phonograph played a song that seemed too cheerful for war, In the Mood by Glenn Miller. The brass notes rose and fell with gentle defiance, as if the music itself refused to acknowledge destruction. Hans blinked, disoriented. His body was weak, but his mind was racing. Was this real? The last thing he remembered was the medic's voice, the warmth of morphine, the sergeant's cigarette, and then blackness. Now he was here, in a hospital that felt more like a sanctuary than a prison. A shadow fell across him. "Guten Morgen, Captain Lerche," came a woman's voice, careful German, slightly accented but clear. He turned his head and saw an American nurse in uniform. She wore captain's bars on her collar and a small silver cross pinned above her heart. Her face was composed, professional, yet there was a calm kindness in her eyes that disarmed him instantly. "You speak German?" Hans asked hoarsely. "A little," she replied with a faint smile. "Enough to check on my patients. I am Captain Morrison." She adjusted his bandage with practiced efficiency. You are healing well. The shrapnel missed the artery. Lucky man. Why, he whispered, why treat me? I am your enemy. Captain Morrison paused, pen hovering over her clipboard. She met his eyes, and for a moment Hans thought he saw confusion, or perhaps disbelief that he even needed to ask. Because you are wounded, she said simply. That is what we do. There was no irony, no hesitation, just truth spoken with quiet conviction. Hans turned his head away, unable to respond. He had no words for this kind of mercy. The days that followed unfolded like a dream he was afraid to wake from. The Americans fed him the same food they gave their own wounded, hot meals with meat, vegetables and real coffee. They even brought him chocolate once, laughing at his surprise when he savored the taste. No interrogations, no shouting, no threats, only care. Each morning Captain Morrison checked his wound, replaced the dressings, and spoke to him in short, simple sentences. Sometimes she asked him questions about his pain level or sleep. Sometimes she didn't speak at all, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. When she noticed him struggling to reach for a cup of water, she helped without hesitation. A small act, but one that shattered years of conditioning. He wasn't being treated like a prisoner. He was being treated like a man. In the evenings, the young medic, Private Denny Miller, the red-haired boy who had first found him, stopped by to change the sheets or deliver letters for other soldiers. He spoke constantly, half for Hans's sake, and half because he seemed unable to stay quiet. Figured you might want to learn a little English, he said one night, grinning. Repeat after me, thank you. Hans tried. It came out as thank you. Denny burst out laughing. Close enough, Fritz, we'll work on it. He mimed the correct sound, sticking his tongue between his teeth. Hans couldn't help but laugh too, a strange rusty sound that surprised even him. He hadn't laughed since before the war turned the world to ash. Later, when the lights dimmed and the ward settled into silence, Hans lay awake listening to the soft breathing of the other wounded. On one side of the tent lay American soldiers. On the other, German prisoners. The only thing separating them was a narrow aisle. And yet there was no hatred. The nurses moved between them freely, their compassion unbroken by uniforms. He thought of the propaganda films, the ones that showed Americans as savages, as monsters who burned prisoners alive. And he thought of Captain Morrison's steady hands, Denny's laughter, the sergeant's cigarette. The lies of the Reich were crumbling before his eyes, replaced by something stronger and infinitely harder to understand: human decency. On the fourth morning, a new visitor arrived, an American officer, middle-aged, with grey at his temples and the calm, assessing eyes of a man used to command. He pulled up a chair beside Hans's bed and greeted him in flawless German. Captain Lerche, my name is Major Patterson. I understand you were a test pilot for the Luftwaffe. Hans tensed. Here it comes, he thought. The interrogation, the real reason for their kindness. Yes, he said cautiously. I was assigned to the test center at Augsburg. Patterson nodded. You've flown the Me-262, haven't you? And the new rocket fighters? Hans hesitated. I have flown many types. The major leaned back, his tone conversational. Good, because we've captured quite a few of your aircraft. The problem is we don't fully understand them. We could use someone who does. Hans blinked. You want my help? Not as a prisoner, Patterson said, almost smiling. As a pilot. You'll be watched, of course, but you'd be doing what you're best at. Flying, evaluating, helping us understand these machines before they kill more men in accidents. Hans was speechless. The Americans were not torturing him. They were offering him work, purpose. Why? He asked again, the question that had haunted him since the crash. Why trust me? Who said anything about trust? Patterson replied. This isn't charity, Captain. It's practicality. You have knowledge we need, and frankly, you have nowhere else to go. The major stood, extended his hand. An offer of collaboration between enemies. After a long pause, Hans took it. The handshake was firm, professional, strangely respectful. In that brief moment, something irreversible shifted inside him. He had entered the war as a loyal Luftwaffe pilot. He had believed that mercy was weakness, that compassion was dangerous. But here, in a tent filled with wounded men from both sides, He realized the truth was far more powerful. Kindness was strength. And it was this strength, not bombs, not bullets, that would end the war. The drive from the field hospital to the new base blurred into a dream of dust and motion. Hans sat in the back of a military jeep, his arm in a sling, his body still sore but alive, impossibly alive. The countryside rolled past in shades of grey and green, villages half burned, bridges shattered, the skeletal remains of trees clawing at the sky. This was Germany, his homeland, unrecognizable, broken. Yet in the midst of ruin, the Americans treated him with the strange, unwavering discipline he had come to recognize as their quiet code. They didn't shout or strike him. They didn't mock. They followed orders, and their orders, it seemed, were to treat him decently. When they arrived at the base near Frankfurt, the first thing Hans noticed was the smell of engines. It was the same scent that had defined his entire adult life: oil, fuel, and hot metal. Aircraft lined the tarmac, captured Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and even a sleek jet that made his heart jolt with recognition. The May 262, his machine. He was home and in exile at once. A colonel greeted him at the gates. "Captain Lerche," he said, extending a hand. "Colonel Raymond. I flew P-47s over France. Heard a lot about your Luftwaffe boys. Mean sons of guns." Hans took the handshake cautiously. The colonel's grip was strong, his expression even. There was no hate, only respect, the kind one soldier gives another. That night, to his disbelief, Raymond invited him to dinner. The table was set in the officers' mess, and to Hans it felt like a scene torn from another world. Pot roast, potatoes, real wine, not the thin vinegar that passed for rations in the Reich. The colonel poured a glass for each of them, even for Hans, who sat stiff and awkward in his borrowed uniform. "You know," Raymond said, cutting his meat with deliberate precision, "your Luftwaffe gave us hell for years. I lost 2 good men to your fighters, damn fine pilots. What made you so effective early on?" Hans hesitated. It felt like a trap, a test of loyalty to a country that no longer existed. But the colonel's eyes held no malice, only curiosity, the kind of curiosity only another pilot could understand. "We had time," Hans answered quietly. "Early in the war, we trained our pilots properly, hundreds of hours before combat. Later, we sent boys with 50 hours. They died in days." Raymond nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "Same story everywhere. War eats men faster than you can train them." He raised his glass. "Here's to the ones who didn't make it, ours and yours." They drank. The wine was heavy and dark, and Hans felt it burn in his chest. For the first time he realized how much grief these men carried too. Different uniforms, same pain. When the colonel refilled his glass, Hans didn't refuse. The next morning, Major Patterson introduced him to the men he'd be working with, American test pilots and engineers who at first regarded him with the cool wariness reserved for someone who had once been the enemy. There were quick glances, half-suppressed whispers, but no insults, only silence and professional distance. Hans understood. He didn't expect friendship. He expected suspicion, maybe resentment. He had flown the machines that had torn holes in their bomber formations, that had sent their comrades plummeting into the forests of Europe. And yet, as days turned into weeks, the distance began to shrink. It started with Captain Jake Larson, a P-51 Mustang ace, tall, confident, with the easy grin of a man who'd cheated death too many times. Their first conversation was stiff, technical. They discussed roll rates, climb performance, ammunition loads. But soon, the shared language of flight took over. "Your 109 seconds turn like devils below 10,000 feet, Larson admitted one afternoon, running his hand along the wing of a captured Gustav model. "But up high you were sitting ducks. Our Merlins chewed you up." Hans smiled faintly. "The supercharger. We never solved that problem. Your engines were magnificent." Larson chuckled. "You just admitted we built a better bird. Careful, you might get deported." Hans laughed, a genuine laugh this time, and the tension between them cracked like thin ice under sunlight. That evening, in the hangar's amber light, Larson pointed to a silver Mustang with faded invasion stripes and said, You ever flown one of these? Hans's breath caught. No. Well, Larsen said, tossing him a leather helmet. You're about to. The next morning, Major Patterson gave the official nod. The aircraft had been checked, refueled, and painted with Luftwaffe markings for evaluation. Hans climbed the ladder, feeling the weight of both history and irony pressing on his shoulders. The cockpit fit him perfectly. The instruments, clean, logical, made German designs feel almost primitive. He ran through the checklist, his good hand steady, his heart racing. When he fired up the Packard Merlin engine, the hangar filled with thunder. It wasn't the harsh growl of a Daimler-Benz, it was deeper, richer, alive. The kind of sound that carried pride. Clear for takeoff, came the voice through the radio. Hans opened the throttle. The Mustang surged forward like a stallion released, the acceleration so fierce it pressed him into the seat. And then he was airborne. The earth dropped away beneath him. The sky opened wide. For 40 minutes he forgot everything, the war, the pain, even captivity. There was only the machine and the man, united in purpose. He tested the controls, rolled, looped, dove through the clouds. The Mustang responded like it could read his mind, fast, smooth, fearless. When he landed, the world seemed smaller. Patterson and Larsen waited by the runway. Patterson shouted over the idling prop, "Well, Captain, what do you think?" Hans climbed out slowly, eyes shining. "It is perfect," he said in halting English. "Superior visibility, power at altitude, control, unmatched, in good hands, devastating." Larsen grinned. "We figured. You. Sure you don't want to trade sides officially?" Hans managed a thin smile. "Maybe I already have. In my heart." The men laughed, but Hans wasn't joking. Somewhere between the roar of the engine and the quiet respect of these former enemies, something fundamental had shifted inside him. He was no longer just a defeated soldier. He was part of something larger, a kind of fraternity that transcended flags and languages. That night, as the officers gathered in the mess hall, Larsen passed around a photograph of his fiancée back home in Michigan. Another pilot showed a picture of his children. Without thinking, Hans reached into his uniform and pulled out a worn photo of Hildegard holding their little girl. "My family," he said softly. The table fell silent. Then Larsen nodded, smiling gently. "Beautiful wife. Your daughter looks just like her." Hans swallowed hard. "She is 3. She will not remember me." "You'll get back to them," Larsen said, voice steady. "War's almost over. You'll go home. You'll tell them about the crazy Americans who let you fly their best plane." For the first time, Hans believed him. That night, lying in his bunk, the words of Captain Morrison came back to him. "Because you are wounded, that is what we do." He realized now it wasn't just medical care, it was a philosophy, a way of life, strength through compassion, victory through honor. And as he drifted into sleep, he whispered to himself in German, "Vielleicht haben wir verloren, weil sie besser sind, nicht in Waffen, sondern in Herzen." Maybe we lost because they are better, not in weapons but in hearts. The dawn sky was pale silver when Hans walked across the tarmac again. Frost still clung to the grass, glimmering in the low light. The roar of engines echoed from the hangars, the heartbeat of a world he thought he had lost forever. He still wore the cast on his shoulder, but he moved with purpose, his pilot's stride returning one cautious step at a time. The Americans had scheduled a full evaluation of their P-51 Mustang that day. This time it wasn't a test of mercy, but a test of trust. They were letting a former Luftwaffe officer climb into their prized fighter, the very machine that had hunted his comrades out of the sky. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Captain Jake Larsen waited beside the gleaming aircraft, coffee mug in hand, smiling in that easy American way. "Morning, Fritz," he called. "Ready to see what freedom feels like?" Hans's mouth twitched into something between a grin and disbelief. "I am ready to fly," he replied. He ran his fingertips along the polished fuselage. The metal was cool, perfect, without the rough rivet seams that scarred the German planes built in panic during the war's final months. This aircraft was more than a weapon. It was craftsmanship, confidence, and power forged in harmony. Even the smell, the mix of oil, leather, and fuel, felt like home. "Your bird now," Larsen said, stepping aside. Just don't try to defect mid-air." Hans laughed softly, then climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit. The controls were wide, balanced and clear. The canopy curved above him like glass armor. He felt the shiver of awe that only pilots knew, the quiet before flight when man and machine became one thought away from the sky. He turned the ignition. The Packard Merlin engine came alive, with a deep, chest-filling growl that made every nerve in his body respond. It was unlike anything he had flown before, smoother, stronger, unshakably confident. When the tower cleared him, Hans eased the throttle forward. The Mustang surged. Ahead, tires rumbling against the tarmac until they lifted free of the earth. And then, silence. The kind of silence only found in the open sky. He climbed through the mist into sunlight. Below, the wreckage of Europe stretched like a scarred canvas. But above, there was nothing but blue, wide, clean, and endless. For 40 glorious minutes, Hans Lerche forgot he was a prisoner, forgot the flags, the pain, the years of propaganda. Up here there were no sides, only the universal truth of flight. He looped, rolled, and dove through the clouds, laughing aloud at the sheer grace of the machine. It responded to every touch, light as breath, fast as thought. When he pushed it into a steep climb, the engine roared like thunder and he felt weightless, as if freedom itself had wings. In those moments, Hans understood something profound. The Allies hadn't just won with numbers or factories. They had built machines and a mindset that embraced clarity, confidence, and precision. The Mustang wasn't just faster, it was honest. It did what it promised. It didn't betray its pilot. And Hans realized how many times his own nation had betrayed men like him, with lies, arrogance, and pride. When he landed, the runway shimmered with heat. Larsen and Major Patterson were waiting. "Well?" Patterson asked, notebook in hand. "Give it to us straight." Hans climbed down slowly, still dazed from the flight. "It is magnificent," he said simply. "Your Mustang climbs like a hawk and turns like a dream. The engine, it has power everywhere. High, low, fast, slow, perfect balance." Larsen grinned. "And compared to your Messerschmitt?" Hans looked back at the aircraft, sunlight flashing off its wings. "It is better," he said finally, "in almost every way that matters." The Americans exchanged a look, part surprise, part respect. Hans had spoken without pride or politics, just truth. Later that evening, they gathered in the officers' mess. The table was crowded with trays, tin cups, and laughter that felt lighter than the weeks before. Larsen pulled out a photo from his jacket, a smiling young woman in a floral dress. "Sarah," he said proudly, "getting married as soon as I get home, if she doesn't kill me for being late." The room chuckled. Another pilot showed a picture of two small children. Jenny's 7, Tommy's 5, haven't seen them since Normandy. Hans reached into his flight suit pocket and unfolded a creased photograph, Hildegard holding their little girl on a summer afternoon before the war swallowed them. The edges were torn, the colors faded, but the love in their faces was eternal. "My family," he said softly, "they wait for me." The table grew still. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Larsen took the photo, studied it, and handed it back gently. "Beautiful," he said. "You'll get back to them, Hans. You will." Hans wanted to believe him. For the first time, he truly did. Around that table, he didn't see victors or vanquished. Only men who had survived the storm and were trying to remember what peace might look like. When the laughter returned, it was quieter, more sincere. Men shared not boasts of battle but dreams of home. The war was ending, and in that fragile space between enemy and friend, something miraculous was being born. Later, lying in his bunk, Hans replayed the day again and again. The feel of the throttle, the roar of the engine, the trust in Larsen's eyes. The Americans had given him more than a flight. They had given him his purpose back. He realized then that a war wasn't only lost by armies. It was lost when men forgot their humanity. And a victory wasn't truly won until mercy replaced hate. He closed his eyes, the hum of engines still echoing in his ears, and whispered to himself, "Wie leicht ist Frieden einfach, wenn man es sich erinnern, Menschen zu sein." Outside, the night hummed with quiet engines, and for the first time in years, Hans slept without fear. The war ended quietly for Hans, not with explosions, but with a single sentence whispered through the mess hall on May 8, 1945. Germany has surrendered. The words rippled through the air like a breath after drowning. Outside, a few pilots cheered, others simply stared at their hands, unsure what to feel. Hans sat at the long wooden table, numb. For years he had been told that surrender meant dishonor. Yet here, surrounded by men who had once been his enemies, it felt less like defeat and more like release. The next morning, the American flag and the tattered German banner were both gone from the hangar. Only the aircraft remained, silent witnesses to a madness that had burned itself out. The skies were peaceful again, but Hans knew peace was often harder to navigate than war. Work continued, even after the official surrender. Major Patterson's team was now tasked with cataloguing and testing every captured German aircraft. Hans threw himself into it. He evaluated Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, rocket planes, anything with wings. He tested fuel efficiency, takeoff torque, dive resistance, even cockpit ergonomics. For the first time, his knowledge wasn't being used to kill but to understand. It was strange, almost redemptive. Each evening he wrote letters to Hildegard, though he never knew if they reached her. He pictured her standing in the ruins of their home, his daughter clinging to her skirt, wondering if he was alive. The thought haunted him every night. One afternoon in August, Major Patterson summoned him to his office. Papers were spread across the desk, and sunlight poured through the blinds, striping the walls in gold. The Major didn't waste time. "Captain Lerche," he said, "you've done remarkable work. The Navy's test pilot division is impressed." "Very impressed." Hans nodded, unsure what to say. Praise from Americans still felt surreal. Patterson leaned forward. "They want to offer you something." Hans frowned. "Offer?" "A position," Patterson said. "Not as a prisoner, as a civilian contractor. You'd work for us. You'd be free." Hans blinked, unable to process the words. "Free?" "Yes. You'd be released from POW status immediately. You'd help our engineers test jet aircraft, German and American, for future development. The Navy will even arrange to bring your wife and daughter here, permanently." Hans's throat tightened. "You want me to come to America?" Patterson smiled. "We want you to fly." Hans stared at the papers the Major slid across the desk. They were official documents, signatures, stamps, a promise of something unthinkable only months earlier. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why me?" "Because you're good at what you do," Patterson said simply. "And because this isn't just about machines anymore, it's about rebuilding the world, the right way." Hans left the office in a daze. That night, under the pale light of a desk lamp, he wrote to Hildegard. He told her about the offer, about the Americans, about the chance to start over. His hand trembled as he wrote the last line, "They have given me a future, but I cannot take it without you." 2 weeks later, her reply arrived through the Red Cross courier. The letter was thin, the paper fragile, the handwriting shaky but unmistakable. "Hans, we have nothing left. The house is gone. The city is rubble. Our daughter asks about you every night. If the Americans will take us, we should go. Germany needs time to heal, but we need to live. Come for us." Tears blurred the words. For the first time since 1939, Hans allowed himself to weep openly. By December 1946, the paperwork was complete. Under a special program that would later be known as Operation Paperclip, Hans Werner Lerche, once an officer of the Luftwaffe, became an official consultant for the United States Navy. When the day of departure came, he stood on the runway, the cold winter air stinging his face. Patterson shook his hand firmly. "You earned this, Captain," he said, "not because you switched sides, but because you never stopped being a pilot." Hans nodded, too overcome to speak. As the transport plane lifted from the runway, he looked down at the ruins of Germany growing smaller beneath the clouds. For years, that landscape had defined his identity, the flags, the oaths, the orders. Now, he was leaving it behind, not as a deserter, but as a man chasing a second chance. February 1947, Washington, D.C. Airport. When the plane door opened, Hans stepped into a different world. The air smelled of fuel and rain, but it wasn't the heavy scent of despair he remembered from Europe. It was the smell of possibility. The crowd beyond the gate blurred as his eyes filled with tears. And then he saw them. Hildegard. Older, thinner, but radiant. Her hair was tied back neatly, her coat too large for her frame. Beside her stood their daughter, clutching a small wooden toy plane. For a moment, neither moved. Then Hildegard dropped her suitcase and ran. Hans caught her in his arms, the months and years collapsing into that one embrace. She sobbed against his shoulder, her words muffled. "I didn't know if you were alive," she whispered. "Every day, I didn't know." "I'm here," he managed. His own tears fell freely. "We made it." Their daughter approached shyly, studying this man in American clothes who claimed to be her father. "Papa?" she asked in a small, uncertain voice. Hans knelt, his heart breaking and healing all at once. "Ja, mein Schatz," he said, smiling through tears. "Papa is here." She reached out and touched his face as if to make sure he was real. Then she smiled, a hesitant, perfect smile, and threw her arms around his neck. For Hans, the war truly ended in that moment, not with surrender, but with a child's trust. That spring, the family settled near Patuxent River Naval Air Station in Maryland. Their house was small but warm, with a white fence and a backyard that smelled of lilacs in bloom. The Navy provided everything they needed: food, housing, and dignity. To the neighbors, they were simply the Lerche family, the quiet German pilot and his kind wife. No one cared who he had fought for, only who he had become. Each morning, Hans reported to the base to fly again, this time as part of something greater than revenge or conquest. He tested jet fighters, debriefed engineers, and trained young American pilots eager to learn from him. The irony wasn't lost on him. Once, his country had taught men to hate. Now he was teaching their former enemies how to fly safely. And every evening, when he returned home, he found Hildegard waiting with supper and their daughter asleep by the window, a toy airplane still clutched in her tiny hand. Peace, Hans realized, was not the absence of war. It was the quiet miracle of an ordinary life. The first spring in Maryland was unlike anything Hans had ever seen. The trees bloomed in colors he didn't have names for. The air was clean, sweet with grass and salt from the nearby river. Each morning, he woke to birdsong instead of sirens. There were no gunshots, no bombers overhead, only the quiet hum of a country rebuilding the world it had saved. He and Hildegard rented a small white house near the Patuxent River Naval Air Station, part of a growing neighborhood of military families. Children played in the streets with tin airplanes and wooden kites. The neighbors were curious but kind. Some knew Hans was German, but few cared. In post-war America, people wanted to look forward, not back. The past, for most, was a story best left behind. Hans tried to adjust. Some days were easy, others were unbearable. He would wake from dreams of flak bursts and roaring engines, expecting to find himself in a cockpit, diving toward black smoke. But instead, he would open his eyes to find Hildegard sleeping beside him and their daughter curled in the next room. Proof that he had survived. At the Navy base, life found rhythm again. Hans began flying regularly, first as a consultant, then as part of the US Navy's test pilot program. He was no longer the German pilot, but simply Lerche, respected for his skill and his calm precision. The American engineers valued his insight into German aircraft design. "You people built some brilliant ideas," they would say, handing him blueprints of captured jets. "Now help us make them safer." Hans did more than that. He helped them innovate. He tested early jet prototypes that would shape the fighters of the Korean War. He advised on flight stability, aerodynamics, and cockpit instrumentation. He even joined collaborative projects with newly formed civilian programs that would one day evolve into NASA. It was dangerous work, but danger, he realized, was easier to face when you weren't doing it for destruction. The other pilots came to trust him. Jake Larson, his friend from Frankfurt, was transferred stateside not long after Hans's arrival. Their reunion was loud and unguarded, filled with the laughter of men who had once been enemies and now shared memories of the same sky. "Never thought I'd see the day we'd be drinking the same coffee, Fritz," Larson joked, clinking his mug against Hans's. Hans smiled. Nor I, Jake. But life, she has strange flight paths. Larsen nodded. Yeah. The trick is landing safe. Over time, their friendship became something more profound, a kind of brotherhood forged in contradiction. They had tried to kill each other once, and now they worked side by side to ensure future pilots lived. Larsen's wife, Sarah, often invited the Lerche family for dinner. Their daughter, blonde and curious, played with Hans's little girl in the backyard. On those evenings, as laughter echoed under the porch lights, Hans felt something he hadn't dared to feel in years: belonging. In 1949, Hildegard gave birth to their second child, a boy. They named him Peter after Hans's father, who had died before the war. Larsen stood as the boy's godfather. During the small christening ceremony at the base chapel, he held the baby awkwardly, his large pilot hands trembling slightly. "We were enemies for 4 years," Larsen said softly when it was his turn to speak, "and friends for 4 more. I hope we'll be friends for 40. If war ever comes again, maybe our kids will remember what we learned, that doing the right thing even in war is how you win the peace." The words hung in the air. There were veterans there, Americans, Germans, and a few quiet British officers, and not one of them looked away. When Sarah whispered amen, the room was silent except for the baby's breathing. Hans never forgot that moment. The years passed like contrails across a bright sky. By the mid-1950s, Hans was testing the Navy's early jet fighters, the F9°F Panther, the F-86 Sabre, and eventually the F-100 Super. Sabre. The transition from propeller to jet had changed everything about flight: the speeds, the sounds, even the way air felt against the fuselage. Yet Hans adapted faster than most younger pilots. The engineers called him the Professor, half in jest, half in reverence. Hildegard, meanwhile, made a home out of foreign soil. She joined a local Red Cross chapter, helped other European wives settle in, and filled their small house with warmth. Their daughter, now 10, spoke fluent English, attended an American school, and began correcting her parents' pronunciation. Peter toddled after her, mimicking her every word. Their lives, once defined by fear, were now measured by small, ordinary miracles: birthdays, picnics, letters from friends, and the soft hum of safety. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Hans and Hildegard sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the river, painting the water in gold. They spoke little. Words weren't needed. Every sunset, every sigh of wind was a reminder that mercy, the kind one soldier had shown in a muddy field years ago, had made all of this possible. By the early 1960s, Hans's hair had begun to grey. He had logged thousands of hours in the air and contributed to more than a dozen successful jet designs. The Navy awarded him a medal for his work in aviation safety, but he rarely spoke of it. The recognition mattered less than the quiet satisfaction of knowing his knowledge saved lives instead of ending them. In 1963, after nearly 20 years of service, Hans retired. His farewell party was held in a hangar decorated with American flags and a single small German one placed beside it, not as an emblem of division, but of unity. Larsen gave the final toast. To Hans, he said, lifting his glass, "The man who proved enemies can be teachers, and mercy can outfly revenge." Applause filled the room. Hans stood, emotion choking his words. "I came to America because one soldier chose not to hate me," he said quietly. "Everything I am now, my life, my family, my peace, began the moment he lowered his rifle." The hangar fell silent. Even the engines outside seemed to pause. Hildegard, watching from the crowd, wiped a tear from her cheek. She understood better than anyone what those words meant. After the speeches ended and the lights dimmed, Hans walked out to the runway one last time. The night air was cool, the stars sharp and clear. Somewhere far away, a jet took off, its afterburner a brief sun against the horizon. He smiled. "Fly safe, boys," he whispered. "Fly safe." The wind carried his words away, as if delivering them to every man who had ever taken to the sky, friend or foe. Retirement did not quiet Hans's spirit, it merely gave him time to listen to it. The world he had helped rebuild was flying faster than ever. Jets broke the sound barrier, men stepped on the moon, and the sky that once brought destruction now carried explorers instead of bombs. Hans often watched the contrails overhead from his porch in Maryland and smiled, knowing he had played a small part in that transformation. He still wore his old leather flight jacket when he walked to the airfield. The young pilots who met him there treated him with a mix of curiosity and reverence. To them, he was a living bridge between eras, a man who had flown propellers and jets, who had fought for Germany yet tested planes for America, and who had somehow turned enemies into friends. "Is it true," one trainee asked him once, "that you were captured and they treated you kindly?" Hans looked up at the clouds, remembering the field, the sergeant, the cigarette, and the medic's trembling hands. "Yes," he said softly, "they were kind. They could have been cruel, but they chose differently, and that choice changed everything." The boy frowned. "Changed the war?" Hans smiled faintly. "No, changed me. Over the years, journalists and historians came to interview him. They asked about German aircraft, about the Me-262 and rocket planes, about test programs and aerodynamics. But the conversation always turned to the same moment, March 1945, the day he fell from the sky and expected to die. "What did you learn from it?" one young historian asked during an oral history recording in 1985. Hans was 76 then, his hair white, his eyes still sharp. He thought for a long moment before answering. "I learned that the values a nation claims to hold mean nothing until they are tested," he said finally. "Germany claimed to represent order and culture, but we treated our enemies and even our own people with brutality. America claimed to stand for dignity and justice, and they lived by those words, even when it was inconvenient. That is real strength." The interviewer pressed, "Do you think that kind of mercy affected the outcome of the war?" Hans nodded slowly. "Absolutely. When German soldiers realized the Americans would treat them fairly, they surrendered more readily. That humanity saved lives, German and American alike. Mercy was a weapon too, but a noble one." He paused, his voice softening. "And after the war, that same mercy won the peace. Germany became America's ally not because of politics, but because we remembered how we were treated. They gave us food when we were starving, work when we were lost, and respect when we didn't deserve it. That builds nations stronger than bombs ever could." The interviewer sat in silence, her pen frozen above the page. Then Hans added one last thought, showing mercy is not weakness. It is discipline, the kind of discipline that makes you worthy of victory. By the 1990s, Hans's children were grown. His daughter married to a Navy pilot, his son working as an engineer for NASA. They were Americans in every sense, their accents perfect, their futures bright. Sometimes, when his grandchildren visited, Hans would pull out the old photo of his Messerschmitt and the black and white image of the American medic who had saved him. He would tell the story again, not as a tale of war, but as a lesson. "Your grandfather was treated with kindness by people who had every reason to hate him," he would say, his voice steady but full of emotion. "That is what makes a country great, when it remembers its principles, even when its enemies forget theirs." The children would listen, wide-eyed, not fully grasping the weight of those words. But Hildegard would smile quietly from her chair, knowing that the story and the mercy that had saved them would live long after they were gone. On February 13, 2003, Hans Werner Lerche passed away peacefully in his Maryland home, surrounded by his family. He was 84. Aviation. Magazines around the world carried his obituary, describing him as a test pilot who had flown more than 150 aircraft types across 3 nations and helped shape modern aviation. But to those who knew him, he was more than that. He was proof that compassion could outlast hatred. At his funeral, the chapel was filled with faces that time had carved with age, former pilots, engineers and neighbors. Among them sat men who had once fought against him in the skies over Europe. Captain Jake Larson, now in his 80s, stood beside the flag-draped casket and spoke. "Hans used to say he got shot down over the Rhine and landed in America," Larson began, his voice thick with emotion. "He meant it literally. That day his plane went down, he fell into our hands. But he also meant it here," he said, touching his chest. He found his home in our hearts. He became one of us. Larsen looked around the chapel, at Hans's American children, at his grandchildren with their shining eyes, at the folded German flag resting beside the stars and stripes. That's what winning the peace looks like, he continued. We didn't destroy our enemies, we turned them into allies. Hans was living proof that mercy, when chosen at the hardest moment, can change generations. The chapel was silent except for the muffled sound of someone crying softly in the back row. Outside, a cold wind swept through the cemetery, carrying the faint hum of distant aircraft from the nearby base, a sound Hans had always called the Song of Freedom. When the ceremony ended, Larsen placed a small object atop the coffin, a single, unopened Lucky Strike cigarette, the same brand the sergeant had offered Hans almost 60 years before. He whispered, "He saved you once. You saved all of us many times since." Years later, historians would call Hans Lerche's story one of the quiet miracles of the 20th century, a reminder that humanity could survive even in the machinery of war. His name appeared in books, documentaries, and lectures about reconciliation. But to his family, he was simply Papa, the man who had shown them what honor looked like without a uniform. And somewhere, perhaps beyond time itself, the winds still carried the echo of his words. Mercy is not the end of strength. It is its highest form. The story of Hans Werner Lerche was not about victory or defeat. It was about the simple, enduring power of one soldier lowering his rifle and choosing compassion over hate, a decision that rippled through generations, proving that the truest conquest in war is the triumph of the human heart.